Improving Alpha Innovation in Investing, ESG and Technology with Michael Oliver Weinberg in partnership with Vidrio Financial. Vidrio Financial is a premier data management provider shouldering the responsibility for your data from collection to extraction, transformation and enrichment. Vidrio monitors over 2,000 diverse funds, processing millions of data points each month. Discover how Vidrio empowers your institutional portfolio data by combining advanced AI and human expertise to yield comprehensive analytics on performance, cash flow, risk, valuation, and more. All delivered seamlessly through Vidrio's Data Management Hub. Save your investment team valuable operational time, providing actionable insights like never before. Explore more at vidrio.com.
Hi. This is Michael Oliver Weinberg. We'd like to welcome everyone to the Improving Alpha Innovation in Investing, ESG, and Technology podcast series. Today, Geeta Kapadia, Chief Investment Officer of Fordham's Endowment, will be our guest. So listeners have a high sense of our roadmap. We'll start with some background, then discuss the usual. Investors, academics, and business leaders should be able to extract a great deal of value from Geeta's insight. On that note, welcome, Geeta.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Why don't you start with your background?
Yeah, so I've been at Fordham University for 3 years. And prior to that, I headed up the investment team at Yale New Haven Health System, which is the academic medical center associated with Yale University. I was there for 13 years and had joined Yale New Haven after coming back from a stint in the UK. And before that was in India and started my career in Chicago, which is where I'm from.
And that's where I happen to be today. Great. So let's start with Fordham's Endowment. So obviously, we have a pretty good sense as to what you're trying to do. But for some of the listeners who may be less familiar, obviously, probably there's no one who doesn't know your school. But what's your objective at the endowment?
Yeah, so our objective is to serve our community of 17,000 plus students across 2 campuses in Lincoln Center, at Columbus Circle in the city, and then at Rose Hill in the Bronx. We also have a center in Upper Westchester in Harrison, New York, and a center in London. So our job is to ensure that the endowment is invested in a way that can support those students and the students that are off in the future for many, many years to come, and help to shore up finances as it relates to being able to provide education for that community. So, my goal is to be able to cover our annual spending rate, which is just around 4.5%, and then some, obviously, to keep up with inflation, and ideally to perform regardless of the environment, but also obviously to add as much value as we can to the endowment, just to continue that legacy. The only way that cash comes into the endowment is either from donors or from investment return. So I don't do a lot on the donor side, but the investment return is all my team and I.
And you mentioned inflation, which has been a highly relevant topic since we launched this podcast some years ago, though obviously for many years before that wasn't. Does it impact your investment process, or how do you think about it? Do you, or is it more that you invest exogenously and the managers deal with it effectively?
That's a great question. I think we think about it in a lot of different ways or a lot of different contexts. So naturally, as it relates to the endowment, it reduces our ability to use the endowment as effectively as it could be for things like buildings and equipment and professor salaries and all of that. So we need to make sure that we're able to manage it in some sense. At the same time, I think to your point, we sort of rely on our investment managers to focus on it from a day-to-day perspective. So I'm not trying to make transactions or trying to trade within the portfolio with an eye on inflation. I really am trying to make sure that all of the pieces of the portfolio are doing what they should be doing. And a piece of that is going to be, how do you manage inflation? How does it impact the decisions you make? And how will that, in the end, help Fordham University?
Got it. And then let's shift gears into the primary topic, innovation and improving alpha, which is obviously challenging because everyone in the world's fighting for alpha. How do you do that from an investment perspective?
That's a great question. Also, we think a lot about innovation as it relates to our students, because not only do we want to make sure that the portfolio is taking advantages of all of the breakneck pace of innovation out in the investment landscape, but also that we can provide opportunities for the students to think about how they might be able to not only use innovation that's coming at them every single day in what they're doing here at Fordham, but also in the future. So, how could it be a part of their potential job prospects? How could it inform the type of careers that they maybe want to consider going forward? So not only do we think about asking each manager, investment manager, how are you thinking about innovation and how does it inform what you're doing on a day-to-day basis? But also, for example, I had an opportunity last summer, to identify students in our university that might be interested in doing a internship with one of the leading venture managers in the Valley. And we were so thrilled to be able to provide the firm with a number of candidates who were very well qualified. They were able to select one from there. So that student was able to spend the entire summer interning for a venture capital firm. And ideally, that student is going to come back and share his insights with all of his fellow students, but also potentially make connections in an industry that is changing so fast that by the time he graduates, he may be able to parlay that into, his next position. So we think about it very holistically, not just in terms of the universe in which we work, which is the endowment portfolio, but also holistically, where can it help our students? How can we think about ways to connect them with some of the titans of our industry, which we're fortunate enough to have interactions with?
Okay. And then ESG, another topic that has, through the evolution of this podcast, varied widely from flavor of the day to maybe not so much of the flavor of the day. And again, it depends on which state, which country, which political party, or who's pandering to the aforementioned. Where does the endowment stand on it? Is it, and again, when I was managing alternatives at the Dutch pension, it was part of our fiduciary duty, whereas for most fiduciaries, it's not. Give us your perspective and the endowment's perspective.
Yeah, we think about ESG in a lot of different ways. One, as a Jesuit Catholic institution, the Vatican and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has been relatively prescriptive on the ways that they think about investing in a way that's in line with the Jesuit principles by which our institution follows. So we think about it from that lens. We also think about it from a lens of the community that we serve. And sitting in New York City with students all across the city, as well as in London, we think about their futures and the way in which we want them to go out into the world and express the types of values that we're hoping we're imbuing them with during their time here at Fordham. So we want to be a leader in this space. We want to make sure that we're doing right by our community and by our city. And so there are many ways that we can express that concept or that mission, that vision. And some of them, for example, are things like investing in our community in the Bronx. Our Rose Hill campus sits on Fordham Road, which is a community that is in need of investment. And so one of our very recent initiatives is to work with community leaders to fund the Bronx Green Jobs Center, which is right on Fordham Road down the street from our main gate. And it's providing not only jobs, but innovation. It's providing assistance. It's providing local outreach, networking within the community, opportunities for students, both undergrad and grad students. So, that's just an example of some of the ways we think about how we can best serve the community with an eye towards socially responsible investing and environmental investing. Other things we think about as it relates specifically to the endowment are, what conversations can we have with our managers? How can we impress upon them the importance of investing in a way that works for Fordham? Who are the managers that are best aligned with what we're trying to do as an institution? Who really takes it to heart and isn't just paying lip service to the idea of lots of people are interested in it? And to your point that you raised during the question, given our current environment, given our situation where we are as a nation, what are the things we need to be thinking about, broadly speaking, as it relates to We have our mission on one side, and we have the reality of what's going on right now in higher ed on the other. So thinking through those conundrums, thinking through the best way to attack those types of problems, leadership spends a lot of time, the board spends a lot of time, our president spends a lot of time making sure that we're doing right by our university, by the community, but also expressing who we are as an institution.
Got it. And then the third leg of our podcast is technology. How about innovation from it? And I mean, obviously, you mentioned Silicon Valley, the venture example in the investment perspective, which somewhat overlaps, but otherwise, especially in this pervasive world of AI, and which is obviously a lot of hype, though it will change investing and everything else. How do you feel that?
Technology is, without a doubt, I think the force that's the topic, the force, the impact, it's going to be pervasive throughout what we do on a regular basis. It already is, and yet it's transforming into almost a third leg of our stool of what we do. So I think it's something that none of us obviously are ignoring it. I think some of us are dialing into it more quickly than others. I'm probably a little bit slower just from a personal, like my character is to be a little slower. Part of the best piece of my job is that I have a team surrounding me and other leaders surrounding me. So, I'm fortunate enough to spend a lot of time with we call, the two of us are the two CIOs, me, the chief investment officer, and then our chief information officer. So he and I spend a lot of time talking about how do we make sure that we're working smarter and not harder within our investment office? And a lot of that has to do with all of the AI-related options that we now have to be able to more efficiently manage this portfolio. A lot of it, I think, not just me, but a lot of the CIOs and other teams that I speak with at other institutions, it feels like we're continuing to use technology that we've just been using for so long because we know it works and we know the rights and wrongs of it. We know the good and the bad. But this feels like a real opportunity for all of us to really up our games and start to say, okay, there are ways that we can do this job more efficiently, more strategically, and just more intelligently. And I'm just so grateful that we have the opportunity to spend time with other CIOs, with other investors, and importantly, with other investment managers who do this for a living and so can give us shortcuts and quick ways to cut through all the noise and identify what tools might be most useful for us.
That's a good segue into what's most interesting from an investment perspective now. Where do you see the opportunity?
Yeah, naturally, I'm going to say AI, just to get that out of the way, because of course it is. It couldn't not be. I think I'd be doing our portfolio a disservice if I didn't spend time on AI. And it's just changing so rapidly and so quickly that it's useful for us to spend time there. It's also useful for us to kind of let some of the dust settle a little bit rather than chasing after every latest headline we read and every latest conversation we have. So without a doubt, that's what we spend a fair amount of time thinking about and figuring out how best to play. On the other side, though, I think there's still something to be said for some of the good old kind of value type investments that have suffered so strongly due to the tech bubble that we've all been in. And so, we still like a lot of our investment shops that are tried and true, looking for undervalued names, looking for value creation that you can measure by accounting metrics and you can measure by volume and sales and all of those pieces that we learned about in business school that, continue to have value even in an ever increasing technology-driven market. So whether that's, emerging market companies based in places like India that are not technology focused, but are instead thinking still about the burgeoning upper to middle to upper class in a demographic that has an increasingly large percentage of young, upwardly mobile professionals, whether that's looking at Latin American companies that have been very unloved due to political environment or government regulation, whether that's thinking about Eastern Europe or developed European nations that have not been outperforming due to just a focus on China and technology broadly. I think there's still pockets of interesting companies there. And so we want to make sure that we're not forgetting about many of those investments because I think they'll still come good when the time is right.
And what's the biggest challenge to achieving your goals?
There are many. I think part of it is trying to separate the hype and noise from actual investable, actionable ideas, making sure that we're not swept up or going down rabbit holes of things that seem very shiny and new and exciting, and yet at the end of the day are not going to be sustainable ways for us to outperform over the long term. I think also a fair amount of it is communication. It's not easy to explain a portfolio that has a fair amount of investments in less liquid strategies. And so, although I think it's right that we're invested in them and it makes sense given what we're trying to do with the portfolio, that those strategies, because of the very nature of their time horizon, will not be able to shoot the lights out the way U.S. equities have done every year for many years. And so it's very difficult when, as an investor or just whoever you are, if you have an investment portfolio or if you have a 401k, you can see that your performance is, if it's largely driven by the U.S. stock market, has done very, very well. And so then you might look at an endowments portfolio and say, well, that doesn't make sense. If they're doing this all day long and I'm just a person on the street, why am I able to outperform some of the smartest minds in the business? So trying to understand and communicate the way that this portfolio will perform, it can be challenging. I'm very fortunate to have strong leaders at Fordham who understand those challenges, but it's hard when you can't summarize it in a short headline or, a short 2-sentence explanation. So working through that has been challenging, but in a good way, because it helps us all kind of get to a better place of understanding. And then, I think finally it's trying to do less with more. Not just from an investment perspective, although we are doing that as well, but just from a university perspective. This is not a challenge that's unique to Fordham. Costs of tuition continue to rise. Parents, particularly the parents of students that we look at and we try to work with, those parents find it increasingly difficult to be able to afford tuition. And yet over on our side in the administration, we're finding it increasingly difficult to be able to provide the type of education that these students deserve at a smaller and smaller margin. And so trying to do less with more has really been a theme for many institutions, including Fordham, and it's very challenging. And yet I think we all have the same goal, which is to be able to serve our community. And so we haven't given up on that challenge.
Got it. What's a red flag with a manager such that what's a red flag? Let's see. Wendy, let's just redo that question. I didn't. And anyway,
Okay.
Anyway, thanks. What's a red flag with a manager such that you wouldn't invest?
I think about that a lot because I think there are a lot of managers that wouldn't necessarily be my first choice who have outperformed significantly and added real value to many of my peer institutions. There are so many investment firms out there that I don't believe that there are any firms that if you're not with them, you're kind of out of the game. That being said, there's something to be said for the network that many of these top quartile, top decile names have been able to cultivate. And so there's real value there if you're trying to be the first one on the cap table, if you're trying to lead around, if you're trying to be the one that a founder calls. I mean, there's, I think, a lot of latent value in being able to be associated with some of those firms. I think for us, the red flag, or at least for me and my directors, the red flag is really a manager who's not interested in engaging with us. And in some ways, I can see the rationale behind it because many firms don't have the time to be able to engage with every investor, particularly with a smaller mid-sized institution like Fordham. That being said, that probably just tells me that they're not the right firm for us, because we do feel very strongly about being able to speak to someone face to face, go into their offices, meet them, meet the team of people that are making investments on our behalf. And if we are too small or just not high profile enough for that firm, it's probably just not a great fit. So there are lots of great firms out there that have a policy like that, and they'll probably do very well without our investments. But at the same time, they're just not necessarily going to be the best manager for us. And so I think we value that personal connection. We value being able to look people in the eye. And I don't really foresee that changing anytime soon.
Got it. And what's a mistake that you made investing, but that you learned a really important lesson from?
Well, there have been a lot of them, but I'll pick,
Only need one.
I'll pick one.
Yeah, we all have lots of them.
Yeah. I think that's the good and the bad of mistakes, right? Is that you hopefully are learning something from them.
Exactly.
I would say kind of the overarching theme I've found is that the best thing to do is come very clean with mistakes, because you end up in a much better position than if you try and accommodate it or get around it or make excuses for it or something, which I've all been guilty of earlier in my career. One mistake I made at my former institution was trying to reduce our exposure to a strategy that, for political reasons, was actually important to the institution. And the reason why I wanted to reduce my exposure to it was because it was detracting from performance and it was very expensive. And yet there are bigger picture considerations sometimes about investments like that. And I think it taught me that you can be right and you could still be wrong. So,
Yeah.
your rationale could be right for doing it, for doing something. But if you're not kind of sounding it out with other people, if you're not thinking through the implications or ramifications of that decision, if you are you have blinders on and you're sort of pursuing a path because you just know it's right, sometimes that comes back to prove you wrong. So it's kind of helped me to think more strategically about decisions, more playing the other side of it and sort of being a contrarian to myself, and running things past more people than just, kind of that single-mindedly, no, I know what I'm doing and I'm just going to do it.
Got it. Okay. And entirely shifting gears, but something that we find is interesting to ask people and find out about is, have you read any good books recently, or is there a favorite book you have? It doesn't have to be about investing, could be more broad. Or it
Yes.
could be.
Yes. Yeah. There have been a few of them. One book which I read somewhat recently is a book called Shuggie Bain, which is a book written by a Scottish author. And the book, it's a depressing book. So sometimes I don't like to
That's okay.
I don't like to bring it up, but I have mentioned it at a few events because sometimes those books change you, in a way that it kind of takes time for you to think about and ruminate and, inform you over time how a book has changed you. So it's a book called Shuggie Bain. It's by an author called Douglas Stewart, and it's written about a young boy who grows up in Glasgow in Scotland and the trials and tribulations of his life. And it's sad, but also kind of moving and kind of empowering at the same time. I used to live in Scotland, and so I often like to read books by Scottish authors because they just kind of take me back to my time in Scotland.
I love Scotland. It's a great place. Okay. What advice do you have for other allocators and investors, aside from being more sensitive to the political situation?
I mean, I think that the time that we as allocators spend with each other is so valuable in so many ways. I think we often try and kind of think we should know all this stuff and, we should be able to do it without help. And we should be the thought leaders and we should be telling other people what to do and so on and so forth. But I am very humble about where I am right now. I'm very grateful for where I am. It's not to say I didn't earn it. I think I did earn it. But at the same time, my trajectory here has been the culmination of a lot of different conversations I've had, a lot of different favors people have done for me, a lot of different advice that people have given me. A lot of it is being in the right place at the right time and having a conversation with the person who happens to be the one that you need to talk to right then and there. And so I think about that a lot, and I think about ways that I can be that person for other people. And so every conversation that I have with another investment professional has just been so additive in many different ways, and maybe not immediately additive, like, oh, it's not necessarily a new investment idea or a new person I should talk to about a job, but it might be, hey, you should reach out to my friend who works at this place, and that person might put you in touch with someone else. So I feel like it's this nice continuum of a community that I've just been able to be so fortunate to be a part of and have been so grateful to have engaged with that. To me, it's always valuable time spent, no matter how long or when or where it is.
What didn't we discuss that we should have, or that you're discussing with other allocators now? Actually, before we get to that, sorry, I know what we didn't discuss. As it's somewhat, it changes every day, but the tariffs. Curious to hear your thoughts if that's impacted your investment or portfolio construction, or again, it's something you let the managers deal with.
Yeah, we mostly let them deal with it. We try not to. Obviously, we read about it, we learn about it, we spend time thinking about it. We speak with our head of governmental affairs about it and try to become as informed as we can be about the situation and how it could potentially have any impact on what we're doing on a day-to-day level. But for the most part, from an investment strategy perspective, we're not making tactical changes with regards to it. And we're conversing with our investment firms as often as we can about how they think about the impact it could have on the ways they're managing our portfolios. So we sort of feel like we're a second level of, where we should be spending time on it. But if we're investing with the right firms, then they have been able to do the work on how it could potentially change what they're trying to do. Thus far, the conversations that we've had, I was just in Europe last week. I was in Asia a couple weeks before that. The conversations that we've been having have been they've been more of a, let's wait and see how this plays out, as opposed to, we're changing this and we're changing that and we're doing this and we're doing that. It's been more of a, we're watching and waiting, as opposed to we're making immediate changes to your portfolio.
Got it. That's tough. Okay, then to the prior question, which we didn't get to, which was anything we didn't discuss, because that was the primary thing that I think is being discussed. Anything else that we didn't discuss that either you're discussing with other investors or that you'd like to impress upon the audience at the moment before we wrap up?
I mean, the only other thing really is we're talking about, as it relates to private markets, we're talking about the secondary environment and, historically low distributions from investment firms, large sums of money being raised by some of the largest shops out there, allocators who continue to need liquidity, some more than others based on either the endowment tax or, needs within the portfolio or changes in regulation. Are we at a point where we're going to see more and more of our peers move into the position of being sellers? And if so, is it a good time to be a contrarian and buy some things? So it's a very interesting time if you're an active participant in the private market space, and which we are. So we've been engaging on that topic to the extent that others are willing to talk about it.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's so obvious, and I can't believe I didn't bring that up.
Yeah.
But that said, it's a market I've looked at recently and for some years now. Are you seeing discounts? Because I think there are two countervailing factors. On the one hand, to your point, Yes, there are forced sellers because of the endowment tax, and DPI has been low, or distribution of paid-in capital, meaning, to your point, for those that are listeners that are maybe less familiar with private markets, because M&A has been weak, because the IPO market's been weak for some years now, because we sort of experienced a peak, at least in venture in 21, as well as IPOs. The distribution, and again, this is not for your benefit, but for the benefit of some of our listeners, distributions have been low. So you've had I think you have lately, though, two countervailing factors. One, which is that on the one hand, you do have these forced sellers, but on the other hand, you have this massive explosion in evergreen funds, including in secondaries. And then you have the Goldmans and the Blackstones and the Hamilton Lanes raising literally $20 billion fund 5 or 6, whatever. And so you have this massive demand as well. So I guess, Mike, that's a very long-winded way of asking you, is the net of it that you are seeing better discounts, or is it sort of stable?
So I think we saw, and I looked at this when I first joined Fordham, because as many new CIOs would want, I was interested in trying to turn over some of the portfolio. We saw, as a buyer, as a seller, we saw an improvement in the discount until third quarter of 2025. So we saw that based on the numbers we were getting in 2022, it looked like there was a stronger opportunity for us to exit certain investments at a lower discount to NAV. However, I think, to your point, particularly on the evergreen side of things, which is a whole huge piece of this puzzle, I think that we may start to see some compression on that side. And so as a potential buyer, I'm wondering if the equation may change a little bit. And maybe we had a little bit of a sweet spot from the beginning of 2025 until the third quarter or so, where the numbers were shifted a little bit in favor of sellers. I think we are interested in both of those pieces, in that we would like to exit some of our investments that are just not expected to perform. However, we would love to be in many strong investments that historically Fordham's endowment has not necessarily participated in. And so we've been having those conversations with managers over the past 3 years. We've been thinking about ways that we might be able to access some of those shops. And, we're still hopeful, but it may end up being that the secondary market may be the best way for us to try and do that.
Got it. And that is a good segue to one more controversial topic, which are evergreen funds. Quote, the democratization of alternatives, which to me, again, I'll give you a bit of a preface, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Institutions are full up on alternatives. They have been for years. The growth will come from retail, high net worth, ultra high net worth, family offices, perhaps as well, where they're relatively less exposed to alts. And it's obvious why the alt firms want to penetrate retail and with these evergreen funds. But at the same time, there are various potential misalignments and other adverse implications. And I'm curious to hear where you stand on it, whether you're embracing them, you like them, you don't like them, you're concerned, you think they're great. Where do you stand? Or where does Fordham stand? Or both?
No, it's something I've spoken on previously, and I feel very torn about it. On one hand, I feel that investors should be allowed the widest set of opportunities, regardless of where they fall as far as classification. So whether you're a high net worth investor, whether you're an institutional investor, whether you're a sovereign wealth fund, whether you're a pension fund, whatever you are as an institution or as an investor, I feel that you should be trusted to make your own decisions. And so I have a real kind of uncomfortable feeling when regulation tells someone that because they're only a person, an individual, that they shouldn't be able to access certain investments. On the other hand, as a CIO of an institution, part of the reason why we buy into alternatives is because of their very nature of being long locked and less susceptible to cash flows in and out, and are able to offer institutions lower fees and so on and so forth. So the antithesis of being a retail investment is part of why we are attracted to long-term illiquid investments like private equity and venture capital. So I'm very torn on this subject. And I don't know the answer to it because as an American, maybe, I think we should be able to invest in whatever we want. And if we make mistakes, then that's our problem and we'll learn from them and so on and so forth. On the other hand, as an institutional investor, I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if retail investors coming into a lot of the marketplace is necessarily the best thing for an institution. So still to come, I think some of it will shake out naturally as, just the way that this plays out. I think maybe individuals will say, you know what, this is not for me. But I was telling a panel when I was at Milken in Singapore in October. I was in Singapore visiting for Milken, but also visiting managers. And I have relatives in Singapore. So I went and spent time with them over the weekend. And just sitting there, my cousin was like, hey, I got this deck from my broker about a private equity fund of funds. Do you want to tell me if I should invest in it? And I was like, oh my gosh, you're literally demonstrating my point, is that just every investor is being offered some sort of slice of this pie. And so it's a very fascinating time to be an investor.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I tend to agree with you. I think it's a double-sided coin. I think there are some positives and some negatives. On the one hand, I do believe retail should have access to alternatives. And I think that the prior SEC did a disservice by often not allowing them. On the other hand, if asset managers are going to give them a higher fee, lower returning, inferior product, I think that's more that's highly suboptimal and not a good solution. So I do, like yourself, I think there are positives and negatives. And then to add to that, I know some institutional allocators like yourself who are colleagues who they're afraid they're going to effectively get diluted down alongside with retail. So that's another issue. As you said, you invested in this because it was institutional with lower fees and or ideally higher returns, not for the opposite. And then the other element is I was speaking with a head of one of the world's largest private equity firms last week, and he was saying he thinks so much capital is going to come in. He's investing in vintages now because he's afraid prices are just going to get so bid up because of the indiscriminate buying once the 401k market's turned on. So that's
right. I can see that.
And as alphas come down over the decades in, for example, hedge funds, you could see that in private. Well, I think you've seen it in private markets, and I think you could see that further accelerate.
Definitely.
Okay, great. Well, on that controversial note, Geeta, we'd like to thank you for the interesting discussion and sharing your most valuable asset with us, your time. We hope listeners have a better appreciation for what one of our more thoughtful allocators is thinking about and how we may all benefit as investors and allocators. This is your host, Michael Oliver Weinberg, hoping you join us again for our next episode where we speak with another thought leader who will provide insight into improving alpha via innovation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Improving Alpha Innovation in Investing, ESG and Technology podcast, presented in partnership with Vidrio Financial and sponsored by Alternatives Watch and PEVC Tech. Vidrio Financial offers a cutting-edge data management solution that not only collects and cleans your data, but also empowers investment teams to cut through the noise and extract valuable insights for better decision-making in areas such as valuation, risk assessment, and portfolio management. If you're an endowment, foundation, pension, sovereign wealth fund, asset manager, OCIO, or family office facing challenges with your data pipelines, we invite you to connect with us today and explore how Vidrio can seamlessly integrate with your investment team to enhance your data management capabilities. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Vidrio Financial or our host, Michael Oliver Weinberg. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding investment planning.